What is up, my beautiful gemstones? Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, just welcome. My name is Gemma Jade, but today we are going to be discussing the bizarre mystery of the disappearance of the Sodder children. So I recently covered the case of the Ketty cabin murders and found a fire was lit under me to delve deeper into more unsolved disappearances in the true crime realm. I've always been passionate about true crime, but have my own personal reasons for trying to somewhat steer clear of it here on my channel. However, some of these cases are just too fascinating for me to not look into, and I always figure if I'm diving deeper into a case anyway, I might as well share it with you guys. So if you have an old and very mysterious case that you'd like me to cover in a very honest and unbiased way, please let me know. Reach out to me. I would love to continue this as some sort of series going forward, and it would be so helpful if you all helped me out in choosing the cases. When I write these scripts, I always try to be as objective as possible, but also I try to cut through the BS and call it as I see it at the same time. A lot of you have told me you appreciate this about my coverage, and it really makes me feel good that so many of you trust me to bring you the most accurate information possible. While I can't promise to never get anything wrong, I do promise to continue to do everything I possibly can to make sure that I'm researching well enough into everything that I cover that you all receive nothing but the facts, or at the very least, my honest opinion about alleged facts. I noticed with the Ketty cabin murders case that many sites, even ones I consider reputable and that I use regularly as source material, sites that I absolutely trust, only cover surface details and offer overviews of these very intricate cases. The fact of the matter is, some things can't merely be summed up into a few paragraphs, and the case of the Sodder children, like the case of the Ketty cabin murders, is definitely one of those cases. It's insane to me how 5 whole children can just mysteriously disappear and that it's nowhere near being solved, even all these decades later. I'm sure many of you have heard about this case, and just know, as always, that I did the very best I could and took the extra time to try and make sure I'm providing the most accurate information possible for all of you guys here today. With that being said, let's jump right in. Very early in the morning on Christmas Day, at around 1 a.m. to be exact, in 1945, in a town called Fayetteville in West Virginia, a devastating and disastrous fire broke out at the residence of Jenny and George Sodder. The Sodders had 10 children, 4 of whom were alive and accounted for after the fire settled, and another who was away fighting in the war. That left 5 unaccounted for children. The authorities almost immediately ruled the fire as being accidental and due to faulty wiring, and that will keep coming back. However, there were enough mysterious occurrences and strange things that happened in the days leading up to the tragedy that made a lot of people second guess those findings, and a lot of bizarre things that happened afterwards in the decades to come as well. There was a lot of evidence to suggest something far more sinister had happened and was continuing to happen dealing with this case and the investigation that followed. The members of the family who survived the fire were parents Jenny and George, and 4 of their children, who were 23-year-old John, George Jr., who was 16, 17-year-old Marion, 3-year-old Sylvia, and Joseph, or Joe, as he was actually called, who was 21 and away serving in the Army. The children who disappeared were 14-year-old Maurice, 12-year-old Martha, 9-year-old Louis, and 8-year-old Jenny, and 5-year-old Betty. Fayetteville, West Virginia is a small coal mining town and home to a thriving, very large Italian-American population. When asked about their neighbors, the Sodder family, almost everyone said that they were an upstanding and respectable family. George Sodder's real name was Giorgio Soddu, and he had immigrated from Sardinia in 1908, and at 50 years old, he owned his own truck hauling business. Sardinia is in Italy and is the second largest island on the Mediterranean Sea, second only to Sicily. On December 2nd, 1945, World War II had finally ended, and 8 months earlier, communist partisans had finally killed the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, and because of that, many Italians were divided. They were very divided about this. Obviously, the supporters of Mussolini were outraged because he was killed. Obviously. But George was very politically outspoken and held very strong anti-fascist views about Mussolini specifically. There were many people in the community that did love the dictator, and George ended up breeding bitter distrust among his fellow Italian immigrants in Fayetteville. In the months leading up to the tragic fire, there were a few strange things that happened at the Sodder residence, and it started with a man George had never seen before randomly approaching his house and saying he was looking for work. When George told him that he didn't need any help at the moment, the man turned and looked at the fuse box and told George, quote, "This is going to cause a fire someday," end quote. The man then walked off, but George thought it was weird because he had only recently had the power supply company itself come into the home and check out all of the wiring, and he said everything was working properly and there were no repairs or anything that needed to be done. Another noteworthy visit that was only made more sus in hindsight with a few weeks before the fire when a local salesman approached the Sodders trying to sell them life insurance. When George refused to purchase the insurance and said he really didn't need it at that time, the man suddenly became very angry and remarked, quote, "Your goddamn house is going to go up in smoke and your children are going to be destroyed. You're going to pay for your dirty remarks you've made about Mussolini," end quote. Also, just before Christmas, as they walked home from school, the Sodder boys noticed a suspicious-looking vehicle parked on Highway 21, and the occupant of that vehicle was intently watching them. The night before Christmas was even colder than usual, and at around 10 p.m., Jenny and George were about to go to sleep for the night with 3-year-old Sylvia. Jenny had allowed the younger kids to stay up and play with some toys her eldest daughter, Marian, had bought for them from the dime store where she worked at the time, but she told the boys, Maurice and Louis, that they needed to make sure that before they went to bed, they had shut the chicken coop and fed the cows. The boys agreed, so Jenny, George, and Sylvia went to bed for the night. It was around midnight when Jenny was woken by the phone ringing, and when she answered it, a woman on the other line had asked for some random person Jenny didn't know and had never heard of and who didn't live in the home. She told her that she had the wrong number, but later said that the woman just let out a, quote, "weird laugh," end quote, while others in the background of the call seemed to be cheering loudly and clinking glasses. After Jenny told her she had the wrong number and the call ended, though, she really didn't immediately give it another thought. The Sodder house was quiet by then, and when Jenny went to go and check on the rest of her children, she found Marian asleep on the couch, all the doors unlocked, and the curtains still open. It was the older kids' job to secure the house and make sure all of those things were done before bed every night, but that night, for whatever reason, none of them had bothered to do any of it. Jenny locked up, closed the drapes, and she assumed the other children had gone to sleep in the attic, which wouldn't have been unusual. Then she went back to sleep. About a half hour later, Jenny was woken up by the sound of what she described as, quote, "like something hitting the roof like a rubber ball. It rolled and hit the ground with a thump," end quote. She didn't pay too much attention to it and immediately just went back to sleep. At around 1 o'clock, she woke up again, this time to the smell of smoke. George, Jenny, little Sylvia, Marian, and John all managed to get out of the house, but the staircase to the attic, where Jenny had initially assumed the other kids were sleeping, was already filling up fast with smoke and fire. They did try yelling up into the attic, but there was no response. So no yelling, screaming, crying, or any responses at all from the other children who were presumed to have been up there while all of this was happening downstairs. Jenny said, quote, "I ran to the bottom of the stairs where the children were supposed to be sleeping. I yelled, and 2 boys, George Jr. and John, came stumbling down. Their hair was singed by the flames," end quote. So there were a lot of suspicious things about the scene that still don't make sense to a lot of people, even today. In many people's minds, the most suspicious thing was George's attempts to rescue the kids from the attic as the house continued to blaze. He said that there had always been a ladder that he kept permanently leaning on the side of the house that he kept there for when he needed to do regular maintenance on the home and the property, like clearing the gutter or repairs to the roof, things like that. However, according to what was reported on the night of the fire, when George's first instinct was to go and get that ladder so he could get up into that attic and save his children, it suddenly wasn't where he had always left it. What no one knew at that time was that the ladder was lying in a ditch quite far away from the home. As her father attempted to find the ladder or some other means of gaining entry into the attic, Marian tried to call the police. That attempt at reaching the emergency services was quickly foiled when she realized right away that the phone wasn't connected. Eventually, after some time had passed, a neighbor had gotten in touch with the authorities and the fire department from a phone in town somewhere. George finally realized he wasn't going to locate the ladder, and so his second thought was that he should drive his work trucks to the side of the house, climb on top of them, thereby reaching the windows to the attic room and getting in that way. Once again, though, his attempts were seemingly purposefully thwarted because he realized right away that neither of his trucks would start. The house was burning faster and faster, and time was running out this whole time, and I'm sure all of the survivors were desperate to get to the younger children at that point in time. The Sodder family faced one disastrous misfortune after another, and their entire house burned to the ground in only 45 minutes. Somehow, the fire department didn't show up to fight the fire, so they didn't show up on scene until 7 in the morning. That's around 6 hours from when Jenny had first smelled smoke and realized what was happening at around 1 a.m. The firefighters searched and picked through the rubble, and the neighbors searched the surrounding areas for 4 whole hours until 11 a.m., but came up with no sign of any of the other children nor where they could have gone. Though the state police initially concluded that the fire had started due to faulty wiring, they did eventually recant that statement. The fire chief of Fayetteville at the time, Chief M.J. Morris, conducted a thorough investigation and said he could find nothing that would contradict the original assessment of faulty wiring being the cause for the devastating and deadly blaze. He also never found any evidence of remains or bodies in the wreckage or in the area in general. Now, when I say he conducted a thorough investigation, I say that he said he did, and most people believed him at first. The next day, a man named Charles Payne went from the funeral home to the house to collect the bodies, but he also found no additional remains. Years later, his wife named Velma would say, quote, "It seems to be a mystery," end quote, when she was asked about the case and what ensued afterwards. The coroner put together an inquest several days later after the fire had happened, and it consisted of a jury who were brought in to determine the cause of the fire. But one of those jurors happened to be the man who had initially told George Sodder that his home would burn in flames and his children would be destroyed. Yeah, remember that guy? So nobody here should be surprised when I tell you now that the jury for that inquest also found that faulty wiring must have been the reason for the inferno. Obviously, the Sodders did not agree with this and were rightfully pissed off. In fact, they were telling anyone that would listen that while they watched in horror as their house burned to the ground, presumably with their youngest children inside of it while they were helpless to do anything because of a series of strange coincidences, all of the lights in the house burned brightly for a really long time before the blaze finally took those lights out. Jenny later elaborated on this fact and said there was no way, with all of the terror, the confusion, and the commotion happening while she, her husband, and the other kids got out, that they would have been able to see anything to find their way out of the house if the lights hadn't been on. Guys, this was the 1940s, and it wasn't like it is today. Electricity wasn't as safe, and if the wires were faulty, then all the lights and electronics in the home would have been dumped right away. In addition to all of that evidence to the contrary of the official finding of faulty wiring, George had just had all of the wiring replaced in the house so that he could have a new electric stove installed. There is absolutely no way in this world that faulty wiring could have been the problem, but no one would listen, and the investigation into what started the fire had already been closed. The conclusion of faulty wiring stood against all of the evidence to the contrary of it. The so-called facts, as stated and opined by the people in charge and other officials, just didn't add up, and it left the Sodders wanting answers and asking a ton of questions. Obviously, their kids were gone. Again, they were well within their rights to ask those questions, and for any normal human being with any amount of common sense, they felt like someone was covering something up. However, there was much more than just the lights that had the Sodders doubting everything they and the public were being told about this fire. There was a lot more going on here that made them suspicious, and now that the fire had happened, now that they had lost everything, they were thinking back about all of the little moments of time, all of the little things that had happened leading up to the fire, and they were finally putting it all together to try to make sense of it. In other words, they were making connections finally, and it all added up to making even less sense. After the fire, a telephone repairman involved in the investigation told them that someone had cut their phone lines. It wasn't because the lines had been burned, but because someone had sabotaged their chances of immediately calling for help. Sabotage was the reason Marion couldn't get a connection. While the fire was still a raging inferno, some of the neighbors said that they saw a man stealing a block and tackle from the Sodder home. The police did at least make an arrest of that man, and he admitted that he had climbed up and cut the wires. Let me interject here. This man had to cut the phone lines to steal some fishing gear? Does that make sense to anyone else? Maybe I'm just missing something here. Let me know in the comments, because I seriously have no clue about fishing, but it doesn't sound like it makes any sense at all. The man said he thought he might have accidentally snipped the electrical cables, which for whatever reason he was trying to do, but instead snipped the phone lines. Okay, so I guess that does make sense because he was trying to make sure it was dark and he wasn't seen. But it still sounds sus to me that he would go through all that trouble of snipping and cutting any wires just to steal some fishing gear out of, like, the garage. The house was dark. It was quiet. It was 1 a.m. They were sleeping. Why did he feel the need to cut the electrical wires? I mean, it doesn't make sense to me, but the police seem to have accepted his reasoning. But honestly, I have no way of knowing because there's no information publicly available about that man, what became of him, whether or not he was actually arrested, etc. Looks and seems to me he was questioned and let go, but I can't know for sure, so don't quote me on that one. There was also a bus driver who worked the late shift who later came forward as a witness, and he said he saw, quote, 2 balls of fire, end of quote, landing on the Sodder's roof. By now, more and more people thought the circumstances were pointing to arson and not the original official cause that they were being spoon-fed. Then there were the witnesses who came forward and reported seeing the missing Sodder children. Let's chat about those several witnesses for a minute. There was a girl who said she saw all of the kids driving away in a car as the inferno raged behind them. Then there was someone who worked in a motel about 50 miles outside of Fayetteville at the time who said that after the day of the fire, they saw the kids with their own eyes. So the day after the fire. I think by now their faces were plastered all over whatever media was available at the time, which I think was the newspaper and the press, and probably it was a hot topic on the radio as well. I don't know if there were any TVs at the time, guys, but I'm sure if there were, these kids were all over it. Maybe? At a hotel in Charleston, which I believe is more than 300 miles away from the Sodder residence, an unnamed female witness said she saw the kids checking in, and I have a quote from her here that says, quote, "The children were accompanied by 2 women and 2 men, all of Italian extraction. I tried to talk to the children in a friendly manner, but the men appeared hostile and refused to allow me to talk to these children. One of the men looked at me in a hostile manner. Then he turned around and began talking rapidly in Italian," end quote. I don't know what became of any of these alleged sightings, but I'm sure it was so much harder back then than it is today to verify witness accounts, especially when it involves investigating whether or not people are who they're thought to be. There was no surveillance or anything like that, even at the hotel, and all of the investigators had to go out there to where the witnesses were from and have a look around. There was also a missionary who had seen the kids' pictures in the paper, so that answers that question, and she said she had recently seen the kids in a house in Cortez, Florida. This is crazy, and I think it's insane because you can imagine how the Sodders felt when all of this information of all of these sightings were coming in, and there was nothing they could do to verify any of it, and they had to sit not knowing whether or not their beloved and precious kids were deceased or alive. I can't even imagine it. So, there was a private investigator who at the very least investigated the last sighting, the one made by the missionary, and he reported that the kids had been there, that the Sodder kids had been in a house in Cortez, Florida, but that they were, quote, definitely gone, end quote, by the time he got there. He found no less than 5 additional people who had spotted the missing Sodder children in Cortez, Florida at some point. Obviously, the Sodders weren't happy with the conclusions drawn by the officials investigating the case, and they were more and more frustrated with each passing day. Jenny decided to investigate herself as best as she could, and she did the best she could with what she had to work with at the time. She started by experimenting with animal bones on her wood stove. She did everything she could to get the bones to burn down to nothing or to burn to ash. It hasn't been specifically mentioned yet, but I will say that the officials said that the kids that disappeared didn't actually go anywhere, and merely that the fire had burned so hot that their bodies were completely and totally disintegrated. Now, I would have been on board with that as maybe like some sort of reasonable doubt if it were 1 child, but 4? There's no way there was no trace at all of any of them in the rubble or remains of that home. Not even any teeth were found. So anyway, Jenny was working on the animal bones on the wood stove, and no matter what she did, the bones didn't turn into ash or dust. Then Jenny read in the newspaper that there was another house fire and it had killed 7 family members. She knew for sure she was onto something, but she didn't know what. With that instance, the investigators had gathered at least some of the remains of every one of the 7 family members that had died. She was so frustrated by the lack of care, concern, or cooperation from the authorities and other investigators that she reached out to a crematorium worker, and he certified that even bodies that burned at 2,000 degrees for 2 whole hours would leave, at the very least, some charred bones. Just for some context, okay? At Ground Zero in New York, when the September 11th attacks happened, human remains survived fires from jet fuel. Okay, jet fuel. So the crematorium professional Jenny spoke to told her that it's almost impossible and definitely most improbable that an electrical fire that lasted only 45 minutes from start to finish would have completely disintegrated her children's bodies, bones, and any kind of remains. He said it's not possible that appliances were left behind and somewhat intact, but that the bodies left no trace evidence behind at all. This is when George and Jenny hired a private investigator of their own named C.C. Tinsley, and he said he would do everything he could to help find out what happened to their missing children. This investigator heard that the fire chief, Chief Muahz, was going around and telling people he had found a whole human heart at the scene, but he had just buried it in a dynamite box somewhere. My first thought about this was like, oh, that's obviously hearsay, but that it didn't sound implausible due to how the man initially handled the investigation, right? But then I was shocked to learn that investigator Tinsley actually spoke to the chief and convinced him to dig up the box and show it to him and George Sodder, which he actually did. Muahz, Sodder, and Tinsley went there and saw for themselves what the chief had found and buried. This is so shocking. I don't even know what to say about it right now, so let's just see what ensued next, shall we? Tinsley took the organ, the alleged human heart that was buried by the fire chief that he said he had found in the remains and rubble of the Sodder home, to a funeral director for examination. The director concluded it was a piece of beef liver and not a human heart, and after hearing that, George sent it to Washington for more testing and received notice eventually that it was nothing more than some beef liver. Now, that's all well and good, I guess, but why is there no investigation into why Chief Muahz thought he had found evidence of remains but then went and buried them? Why wasn't he ever held accountable for that? You can't just be like, oh, some remains. I'm not going to tell anyone about this. Why was that never investigated? It gets even worse, too, because that organ, those beef livers or that beef liver was determined to never have been in a fire, meaning he did not find it in the wreckage or the rubble. He either went and purchased it and placed it there, or he went and purchased it and buried it, or someone else placed it there after the fire, knowing the police chief would go there to find it. But it still doesn't explain why he just went and buried it. So I wrote, now, at first I thought the implication was that the chief had done this, but then it occurred to me that it was more than likely the person or people who had started the fire in the first place, because let's be real, at the end of the day, this case was quite obviously an arson case. However, I was shocked again to learn that it was the chief who had done this, and he admitted to several people that he had done it and had staged the organ and placed it in the rubble to try and get the family to stop investigating and move on. He said he really wanted the Sodders to believe that those kids had perished in the fire. Is no one here even wondering why he would do such a horrible and heartless thing, besides me? Was it because he couldn't stand their pain and was trying to ease it for them the best way he could by doing that idiotic and cruel thing? No, because he never told them he found it, right? It just doesn't make sense. If he wanted them to believe that he found that and it belonged to one of their children at least, why wouldn't he have said, look what I found? Instead, he buried it. I don't know. That's very weird. Could it have been that he was trying to help cover up what he knew was an arson from the very beginning and that he was possibly involved in? Not only the chief, but all of the other investigators, for the most part anyway, were in on it and agreed they just wanted the family to believe the kids were dead. I don't have any of the answers for the questions of why. I just asked, by the way, because there was no information as to whether or not these authorities, the chief specifically, were asked about why they had done that. The motive to me feels more like a cover-up than anything else. But that's just my honest and humble opinion. 3 months later, for some reason, Sylvia, the 3-year-old, was playing in the fire rubble when the Sodders once again were revisiting the site of the disaster when she found a hollow green object that was made of some sort of hard rubber. It had a twist cap, and Jenny and George both wondered if it could have been a part of whatever object had initially hit their roof on that fateful night. They knew by now that their home had been purposely burned down. They had been targeted, but they also knew no one was going to keep investigating and do anything about it. George took the items to some military officials and casually asked them what it could be or if they knew what it was at all. The men replied that it was, quote, an incendiary pineapple, end quote. For those of y'all that don't know, that's more commonly known as a napalm bomb. In 1948, the Sodders hired a pathologist from Washington, D.C. named Dr. Oscar B. Hunter, Jr., and George Sodder told him that a few days after the fire, he had covered what remained of the basement with several feet of dirt because he and his wife were planning on turning that spot into a memorial for their lost children. Hunter decided to excavate the site, and during the excavation, some human vertebral bones did surface. He sent them immediately to the Smithsonian Institution. This seemed like an amazing lead, but it turned out that the age of whoever belonged to the bones didn't match the age of any of the missing children, and they showed no signs that they had been charred at all. I found a quote about that discovery that said, quote, "The bones, the report concluded, were most likely in the supply of dirt George used to fill in the basement to create the memorial for his children," end quote. That's a little weird to me because it said the age of the bones was inconsistent with the Sodder children, but not that the bones were like animal bones and the Sodder kids were human children. So my question would be, who did the bones belong to? Did nobody care that these were actual human bones? Why did no one think to investigate this or investigate where George got the dirt from and who belonged to those bones and bone fragments? Anyway, I digress because that's the end of that, apparently, so we'll never know. In 1968, this disappearance would become even more mysterious and convoluted when the Sodders received an envelope in the mail, and inside of the envelope there was a photo of a grown man who they all thought greatly resembled their son, Louis. There was no return address, and the postmark was from Kentucky. There was also a message contained in that envelope, and it said, quote, "Louis Sodder. I love brother Frankie. Lil boys. A91032 or 35, end quote. So this makes absolutely no sense and is just as nonsensical as this whole thing having been started by some faulty wiring, right? I don't know what it meant, and neither does anyone else, as the mystery of the photo and the message have never been solved. And mostly, though, people do think it was nothing more than a cruel prank being played on the family by some heartless loser with nothing better to do. In the more than 2 decades that followed the fire, Jenny and George would receive all types of leads in the forms of photos and letters, clues people thought they found, and the odd sighting of grown-ups these people thought even slightly could resemble the Sodder children. But none of the leads or anything ever went anywhere and only further compounded their investigation and made the case more confusing than it already was. Not a single one ever proved to be reliable at all, and that made me so sad when I read that. And once again, I couldn't even imagine being in their shoes for 1 second, let alone their whole lives, for the most part wondering where their children were and knowing the police were not going to help with any sort of investigation at all because they had immediately blamed it on a nonsensical issue. It's heartbreaking. It really is. You can find the image of the young man in the photo sent to the Sodders in 1968 and a photo of him when he was 9 right before he disappeared on the public domain with a quick search. And if you decide to look it up, please let me know what you all think, because to me there really is a strong resemblance and I can see why the Sodders really thought this could be their son. In 1952, George and Jenny Sodder had a giant billboard put up on Route 16 that contained photos of the missing kids, and they offered a $10,000 reward for any information in the case. I don't know the specifics of the reward money, but it was more than likely if they had information about the whereabouts of the children that was verified or verifiable information as to what else had happened to them, but no one ever came forward with anything credible here either. They kept that billboard up for 37 years and had spent a total of about $15,000 to do so, and it was all out of their own pocket and maybe some donations here and there, but for the most part it was their own money. Let's keep in mind that in today's money, that $15,000 is more like $200,000. And just imagine that for a moment, these poor desperate parents. That money wasn't only for the billboard though, of course, and it paid for a whole slew of private investigators and all of the travel expenses to go throughout the country, tracking down and following leads and things like that. Whatever it was spent on, that was a lot of money, but I'm sure for those 2 parents it was well worth the money, even for the chance that they could finally find out what happened to their beloved children. So while we already talked about all of the problems with the initial investigation landing on faulty wiring as the cause of the fire, let's talk about how the evidence does not at all point to those kids being completely burned to ash and dust until there was nothing left in the fire. It just isn't possible, and honestly, in my opinion, it isn't even plausible. It's stupid. So it wasn't a secret that at the time of the fire, there were several members of the community in Fayetteville, mainly of Italian origin, who had some real grievances and issues with the Sodder family, specifically the father, George. Many people think that there was a lot of evidence to foreshadow what would happen on that fateful Christmas morning. First of all, remember the odd late night phone call that Jenny answered where some woman was laughing weird and there was clinking glasses and celebration in the background? That was more than likely someone involved with the fire and the disappearances just calling to make sure there was someone home at the time, because it wasn't long after that, either a half hour or an hour tops, that something hit the roof and Jenny heard it and the house went up in flames. Make no mistakes, guys, someone did throw one or several Molotov cocktails or napalm bombs at that house that night. And though there's not much evidence to back it up, I believe it with all of my heart. Absolutely. After all, how would there be any evidence when, without even taking the time to investigate anything fully and to the best of their ability, the authorities decided the fire was electrical and just closed the case basically immediately? Also, could it really be a coincidence? Only the children that stayed up later than the others to play were the ones who ended up missing. How do we know they even ended up in the attic? Now, I understand 2 of the children did come running down from the attic, but I never found any information that they agreed with their parents or said anything that the other children had made it to the attic with them. And that would have been really something I would have loved to have found. Like George and the other kid that came running out of the attic, like, hey, were your brothers and sisters up there? Yeah, they were. Were they or weren't they in the attic? I just don't know. I haven't been able to find it. They could have been taken before the fire even started. There were no responses except for the 2 kids that came down from the attic when Jenny and George frantically called up to them to see if they were okay. And at the time they did that, the place hadn't yet been overwhelmed to the point anyone should have been unconscious or anything like that. These were the youngest of the children, and therefore in such a traumatizing and scary situation, the only thing they would want more than anything in the world would be their mother, who was calling for them at the bottom of the stairs. The most logical conclusion in that situation, though, is thought to be that the enemies of George Sodder wanted him to know that there was foul play involved, but obviously didn't want it proven, and that's why so many people still come to the conclusion that the Italian mafia was involved, and that's how they were able to get the fire chief and other head and very important officials to play ball, so to speak. The last family member left of the Sodder family was Sylvia Sodder Praxton, and she did her best to honor her parents' dying and lifelong wishes that her siblings who were lost in that fire on that Christmas night so long ago would never be forgotten, and that their story would forever remain alive until the real story could be uncovered. At least that's what she did up until she died in April of 2021. Sources say she died of a long illness. Up until her death, she organized a memorial meeting in Fayetteville every year. George Sodder died when he was 79 as well, just like Sylvia, but he passed away in 1969. Jenny Sodder died 20 years later in 1989 and continued up until her death when she was 85 years old to grow flowers at the memorial garden at the site of the fire her husband had set up when he used that dirt with the bones in it. Jenny and George vowed to never stop searching for their lost children for as long as they were alive to do so, and that's a promise they kept. Unfortunately, they never received any real answers, and there's still no conclusion to this case unless, of course, you believe in all the coincidences, that they were just that, and that faulty wiring was the cause of the whole thing. I like to do some final wrap-up research at the end of the scripts to see if there's anything I missed, and in this case, there were a few things I wanted to discuss with you all before we end. I wondered why the fire department had taken so long to respond to the fire. It was something like 7 or 6 hours from the time the call had come in until they arrived, and I questioned how rural the area was or how experienced the department was in that place and at that time. What I didn't come across until my research at the end here was the fact that the family's residence was only 2.5 miles away from the closest fire station, and it was the middle of the night, so there's no way at all it should have or could have possibly taken them that long to arrive. Within 45 minutes, the entire home had collapsed into nothing but a heap of burnt rubble, and one of the neighbors had finally had enough and decided to go and drive around looking for the fire chief to call his attention to this fire. That's how terrible it was and how ridiculously long it took them to get to the scene. I don't know if that neighbor found the chief, and I bet you he didn't, because it still took 7 hours for them to get there, or several hours at least, since the neighbor headed out to go and find him. Where was the chief? You know, where was he at 1 a.m? Nobody knew where he lived. I also found that George had merely thought the angry life insurance salesman who had threatened him and the lives of his entire family that one weird day in October was simply mad because he hadn't been able to close the sale. And since he worked on commission, it was that big of a deal to him. George and Jenny, I guess, gave people the benefit of the doubt, which is commendable. And honestly, even if they had been suspicious, who would they have gone to? Because no matter which way you want to slice it here, no authorities were interested in helping this family of even while 5 of their children were missing and their house was burned to dust. I believe it did have to do with the Italian mafia, though I never thought I would ever hear myself say something like that. It sounds so ridiculous to me. Going into this case, I was also giving the benefit of the doubt, but to investigators, which is something I try my very best to do while writing these scripts. At the end of the day, though, there's just no way to continue to do that once we know all the facts. I also questioned why George wasn't upset that the weird and random guy who showed up looking for work, and when he was turned away, he randomly looked at the fuse box and said faulty wiring would cause an electrical fire that would kill his whole family, basically. Of course, I'm paraphrasing there, as I already went over this. I want to show you all how confusing research can be and why and how it's so easy to get it wrong, even with the best of intentions. It turns out that guy who was looking for work was looking for electrical work and had claimed to be an electrician by trade, and that's why he specifically mentioned the fuses or whatever. Now, it turns out, too, that George was really shaken up by what that guy said, and he called the electrical company that had just rewired his entire property in order to install the new electric stove, and he was pissed. He told them that this random maintenance electrician had threatened him and what he had said specifically, but they reassured him that there was no way anything like that was going to happen, and they stood by the work they had just done, which, to be fair, up to the night of the fire, had shown no faults or issues, okay? There was nothing wrong with that electricity. They were so sure about this that they insisted it and even reminded George that it was more than likely if the guy was that desperate for work to have been going door to door, then it was more than likely as well that he was looking for something to point to that needed fixing, possibly so he could not only obtain a job, but to upsell George Sodder as well. That makes perfect sense to me, so now I finally understand why George kind of just let that go and moved on. He didn't. He did get upset about it, and he did look into it. During the inquest into the fire, it was said that the fire started in the basement due to faulty wiring of the Christmas lights. So this whole time, most of the articles have you thinking it's just faulty wiring in general, and I was wondering how that was possible, and just so you know, it still sounds extremely improbable that with an entire new electric system throughout the entire home, including in the basement where the Christmas tree and lights were plugged in, would be sparked or started by some tree lights. I mean, no, it just doesn't sound right. Also, that man who threatened to basically that George and his kids would be burned to death in a fire, the life insurance salesman, he was one of the jurors at the inquest, as I already said. But I found out, too, that he is the one who pushed for the kids to be declared legally dead, even with absolutely no evidence whatsoever that they had, in fact, perished in that blaze. I'm going to lift a full quote from List Verse that will make more sense to you the way they said it than any way I've thus far attempted to explain it. So here it is, quote, "Bones do not exactly melt, it's more falling apart as they are very solid," end quote. For an entire skeleton to be destroyed in a fire, the temperature is required to burn at more than 850 degrees Fahrenheit, 454 degrees Celsius, consistently for 2 hours. The Sodder family home was on fire for 45 minutes as the wooden frame structure and wind speed that night meant the property did not stand a chance. Considering how long it took for the house to collapse, there should, in theory, still be the skeletons of the 5 children amongst the debris, yet these were never recovered from the site, end quote. There are rumors that there was a total of $75,000 worth of life insurance on the children, but there never was any, and I checked that out myself through public record and lots of digging. Many people thought in later years that the Sodder children had been kidnapped, but doesn't that just lead to more questions than answers? I mean, how do 5 young kids go missing from their home in the middle of the night without ever making even the smallest sound and without waking up any of the older children or their parents? Jenny had locked the doors, though, and just assumed that the kids were in the attic. She never got any response, so was the door unlocked because that's how the abductors had gotten the children out of the house, and if so, how did they get in? The drapes were open, so maybe someone the kids knew, even just in passing, because remember, kids are very trusting of adults, knocked on the door or otherwise got the attention of the kids through the window, and the kids just opened the door and went with them willingly. I mean, it makes as much sense as anything else I've read so far from this convoluted and confusing disaster of a case. It also turns out that George had emigrated from Sardinia when he was only 13 years old and would avoid the topic of why he left his home country like the plague, according to those who knew him. They said that no one really knew why he left or if he had been sent away, which of those was actually the case and or why. Now, George had worked his way up to owning his own coal trucking company and then met his wife, Jenny. Jenny was known as Jenny Cipriani, and she was an Italian immigrant. The coal trucking business George Sodder owned was constantly under pressure from the Sicilian mafia, and George knew it. A couple of weeks before the fire, the kids said that strange Italian-looking men had been following them home from school. Exactly what type of pressure the mafia was putting on the business is anyone's guess, but that combined with his strong views about the mainly beloved, at least in that community, Mussolini, it was a recipe for disaster. Jenny and George ended up framing the strange photo of the boy who was allegedly their son Louis as a grown man, and they put it above their fireplace. So clearly, they believed it to be him. Despite the case of the disappearance of the Sodder children being such a high-profile case, it has never been investigated by the FBI. In 1947, George appealed directly to J. Edgar Hoover himself about getting the feds involved in, at the very least, finding out what happened to his children. Like, forget the fire. I don't care. Just please help me find my children. He did get a response, but it was a bunch of baloney, to say the least. Hoover wrote them a letter personally that read, quote, "Although I would like to be of service, the matter related appears to be of local character and does not come within the investigative jurisdiction of the Bureau." End quote. FBI agents came forward at the time and said they would gladly help the family anyway, and in any way that they needed them to, but that they just had to wait to receive the go-ahead from local authorities. But of course, the local police department and the fire chief refused to grant them that permission. Sylvia was only 2 or 3 years old on the night of the fire, and she died while in her late 70s in 2021, so the odds that any of the children who had gone missing are even still alive today are very slim. Slim to none, in fact, in my humble opinion, but even so, I think there's information out there, even if it isn't in the form of a live person or a witness, that could still blow this case wide open, and I feel it would be found by investigating into the Italian mob in that area at the time and their connections to the fire chief and whoever was calling the shots in the police department that initially investigated this case. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. That's all I have for you today, guys. Please give this video a big thumbs up if you enjoyed this content, if you enjoyed hanging out with me, and if you enjoyed hanging out with one another in the premiere. I got a little tongue-tied towards the end there, more so than usual, because I had to stop for a minute in like the last 10 minutes of this because we just had another earthquake. Not a very bad one, but definitely could feel it, and it's a little creepy. I'm a little creeped out. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please check out the description box for some important links, ways to donate to the channel, PayPal, Cash App. My Patreon is back up and running. Slowly but surely I will get content on there, but if you pledge $20 a month or more, you will automatically receive every single month a general, personal, intuitive oracle reading from me to you as a thank you for the donation until I can do more with the Patreons and the memberships. The tentative schedule for the week of all the live streams and the pre-recorded uploads, you can also find that in the description box, as well as the Amazon links to my books on Kindle, paperback, and Audible. Every single one of them if you want autographed copies, or if you want to discuss something with me, ask me something, tell me something, or if you want to send me in your own personal stories with the supernatural, paranormal, extraterrestrial, otherworldly, I would really appreciate that. All correspondence can be sent to GemmaJadeParanormal@gmail.com. I know I'm missing a lot, but I had to film a lot today, and I'm kind of just ready to be done. So with that being said, be kind to each other, guys. It doesn't cost anything. Be kind to yourselves and never accept anything less than others being kind to you. If nobody told you today, you're amazing. You got this. Don't ever give up. I got you. I got your back. Always go in grace. Smile at a stranger. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye.